Hidden above the clouds, inside a jagged fortress of ice, lies a secret that defies the laws of nature. This isn't just a vault, it's a vertical graveyard of genetic ghosts where the DNA of every extinct species on Earth is kept in a state of perfect, frozen silence. From the marrow of woolly mammoths to the fragile cells of the dodo, we are scaling the world's most impenetrable peak to uncover the sanctuary that could rewrite the history of life itself. At 22,000 feet above sea level, the air is thin enough to disorient, the cold severe enough to kill, and the terrain hostile enough to deter everything but the most purposeful human endeavor. It is precisely here, at an elevation where most infrastructure becomes impossible and most institutions stop imagining, that one of the most consequential scientific projects of the 21st century has been quietly completed. The vertical vault, a cryogenetic archive embedded into the living rock of a high Himalayan peak, is not the product of a single nation's ambition or a single decade's planning. It is the result of a geopolitical negotiation so delicate and so protracted that its location remained classified until 2025, when a consortium of partner governments jointly acknowledged its existence, citing the accelerating pace of species extinction as the reason they could no longer afford to keep it secret. The choice of elevation was not arbitrary or symbolic. It was the outcome of a decade-long global site assessment that evaluated more than 300 candidate locations across 6 continents, measuring each against a matrix of criteria that prioritized one factor above all others: survivability across catastrophic civilizational scenarios. Underground bunkers at lower altitudes are vulnerable to flooding, seismic activity, and coordinated military action. Arctic installations, while cold, depend on stable polar conditions that climate projections can no longer guarantee. A facility embedded in high-altitude granite, above the tree line and above the reach of most military logistics chains, presented a profile that no other environment could match. The mountain does not merely host the vault. In the most meaningful engineering sense, the mountain is the vault. The pressurized canisters that line the vertical vault's primary archive chambers are indistinguishable from one another by sight. Matte titanium cylinders arranged in temperature-monitored racks, each bearing a 12-digit alphanumeric identifier and nothing else. There are no labels that would mean anything to a layperson, no dramatic iconography of the extinct, no visual language of mourning. The scientists who designed the cataloging system made a deliberate choice to resist sentiment in the physical architecture of the space. The archive is not a memorial. It is an operational library, and it is organized accordingly. But the identifiers, when decoded, open onto a record of biological loss that is among the most sobering documents the natural world has ever forced us to compile. Among the most scientifically significant holdings are the high-fidelity genetic reconstructions of the woolly mammoth and the passenger pigeon, 2 species whose return has been the subject of sustained scientific interest for more than a decade. The mammoth sequences represent the most complete genomic reconstruction yet achieved, assembled from 17 distinct permafrost specimens and processed using 4th-generation error correction algorithms capable of resolving degradation artifacts at the base pair level. The passenger pigeon sequences are structurally cleaner given the species' more recent disappearance, but their significance lies not in the data alone, but in what it represents. The complete blueprint of a bird that once darkened North American skies in flocks numbering in the billions, reduced to extinction within 50 years by industrial hunting. The facility's most recently inaugurated section, designated internally as the Recent Losses Wing, carries a weight that the ancient specimens paradoxically do not. These are the species that did not disappear in geological time or even in historical time. They disappeared within living memory, within the last decade, as accelerating climate disruption outpaced the adaptive capacity of ecosystems that had been stable for thousands of years. Coral-dependent fish species whose reef systems crossed thermal collapse thresholds. Amphibians whose mountain habitats shifted past viable temperature envelopes. Migratory birds whose timing cues became fatally desynchronized from the flowering and insect emergence cycles they depended on. The Recent Losses Wing is the vault's most contemporary mirror, and it is growing faster than any other section. The genetic sequences in the oldest sections of the archive presented a technical challenge that took years to resolve. Degradation. Ancient DNA samples, even those recovered from permafrost, arrive fragmented, broken into short, scrambled segments by the chemical processes of time. The team of genomic engineers responsible for processing these samples developed a suite of CRISPR-based reconstruction protocols that use known phylogenetic relationships to infer and restore missing sequences, cross-referencing candidate reconstructions against the genomes of living relatives to evaluate biological plausibility. The result is not a perfect copy of the original genome. It is a high-confidence approximation, a scientific best estimate of what once lived, built from the partial evidence that time left behind, and preserved here for whatever future has the tools to make use of it. The most dangerous object in the world is not a weapon. It is a blueprint, a sequence of genetic information encoding a complex organism can, in the hands of the right laboratory and the wrong intention, serve as the foundation for biological engineering outcomes, ranging from targeted species revival to weaponized pathogen development. The architects of the vertical vault security system understood from the outset that they were not protecting data from ordinary theft. They were protecting a catalogue of life itself from the full spectrum of state, corporate, and ideological adversaries that a sufficiently valuable target inevitably attracts. The security architecture they built reflects that understanding at every layer. The facility's physical defense begins with the mountain. At 22,000 feet, the logistical requirements for any unauthorized access attempt are staggering. There is no road, no cable infrastructure, no approach that does not require weeks of preparation and equipment that cannot be concealed. The altitude itself creates a sensor environment in which any unauthorized approach generates a thermal, acoustic, and motion signature detectable by the monitoring systems. Positioned across the surrounding terrain. A state-sponsored incursion at this elevation would require military mountaineering assets so specialized that the mobilization itself would be visible to partner governments long before any team reached the vault's approaches. The mountain is not merely a physical barrier, it is an intelligence asset. Within the facility, the security architecture transitions from kinetic to digital and from national to international jurisdiction. Access to any section of the archive requires simultaneous biometric authentication from representatives of at least 3 distinct partner governments, none of whom can belong to the same geopolitical bloc. The data itself is stored in an encrypted format whose decryption requires cryptographic keys held by an international board of scientists, individuals drawn from non-partner nations, specifically to eliminate the possibility of coordinated key compromise through political coercion. The system is designed to make unilateral access by any single government, including the governments that funded and built the facility, structurally impossible. The archive belongs to no one. It is therefore, in the most literal sense, protected by everyone. The ethical protocols governing use of the archived sequences are as carefully engineered as the security systems, and considerably more contested. The international board responsible for access decisions operates under a charter that prohibits any use of archived genetic material for commercial application, weapons development, or species revival. Without a supermajority consensus vote and a mandatory 5-year ecological impact assessment, these protocols have already been tested. A 2025 petition from a private biotechnology consortium to access the mammoth sequences for a commercial de-extinction venture was rejected unanimously on charter grounds. The board's position, formalized in what has become known as the Keys to Life doctrine, is that the genetic heritage of extinct species is a commons that cannot be commodified. The debate over whether that doctrine is sustainable, given the commercial pressures bearing down on de-extinction science, is one of the defining ethical conflicts of 2026. The genetic sequences stored in the vertical vault have always been, in the language of their custodians, blueprints rather than organisms. A blueprint is only as valuable as the manufacturing capacity available to execute it. And for most of the archive's planning period, the technology required to translate a reconstructed genome into a living animal remained far enough beyond reach to make de-extinction feel more aspirational than operational. That calculation changed significantly in 2025 and early 2026, as converging breakthroughs in synthetic biology brought the gap between blueprint and organism closer than it has ever been. The vault's contents, once a hedge against total loss, are beginning to look like something more immediate, a starting inventory. The development of functional synthetic womb technology, artificial uterine environments capable of supporting mammalian gestation from fertilization through full-term delivery without any biological host, has been the most transformative advancement in de-extinction science in recent years. Earlier systems could sustain embryos through early developmental stages, but failed at the physiological complexity of mid to late gestation. The 2025 generation of synthetic womb platforms has now demonstrated successful full-term gestation in several mammalian species. Combined with cross-species surrogacy protocols refined over the preceding decade, these technologies mean that the primary gestational bottleneck constraining de-extinction has, for the first time, become genuinely surmountable. The scientific community is far from unified on whether surmounting that bottleneck is, in ecological terms, a good idea. The debate over resurrection ecology, the reintroduction of extinct species into contemporary ecosystems, has intensified in direct proportion to the technology's feasibility. Proponents argue that keystone extinctions have left ecological holes whose effects propagate through entire food webs, and that restoring lost species could repair cascade damage that no conventional conservation tool can address. Skeptics counter that modern ecosystems have reorganized around these species' absence over decades or centuries, and that reintroduction risks destabilizing systems already under extraordinary climate stress. The argument is unresolved, and the stakes of getting it wrong are considerable. What has moved the debate from theoretical to urgent is the existence, within the vault's mountain infrastructure, of a controlled subterranean habitat in which the first formal revival trial is currently underway. The specific species involved has not been publicly disclosed, but sources familiar with the project have confirmed that a small breeding population of a recently extinct avian species has been successfully established in a sealed, monitored ecological chamber beneath the facility. The trial is measuring behavioral repertoires, physiological indicators, and the animal's ability to perform the ecological functions, seed dispersal, insect population regulation, that their species historically provided. It is, by any measure, one of the most consequential biological experiments in human history, occurring in silence, inside a mountain, at the edge of the breathable world. There are two ways to read the existence of the vertical vault, and they are not mutually exclusive. The first is as a monument to human ingenuity, a demonstration that the same species capable of driving thousands of organisms to extinction is also capable of marshalling extraordinary scientific and institutional resources to preserve what remains. The facility is a genuine technical achievement. The international cooperation it required, the engineering problems it solved, the biological science it has advanced, all of these represent the best that organized human effort can produce when properly directed. If the vault is understood primarily as a scientific platform, it is a cause for something approaching pride. The second reading is harder to sit with. The vault exists because we failed. It exists because the living world, the actual breathing, reproducing, ecologically embedded version of biodiversity, could not be protected in the place where it lived. Every canister in the archive represents a species that the living world could not hold on to. Every sequence in the recent losses wing represents an extinction that occurred not in prehistoric time, but within the operational lifespan of the conservation institutions specifically tasked with preventing it. The vault is, in this reading, a confession, a formal acknowledgement that the rate of loss has outpaced our capacity to prevent it, and that the best we can now do is preserve the memory of what we could not save. The existence of the archive has already begun to reshape the legal frameworks through which we define extinction. If a species' complete genetic sequence is preserved in viable form, is that species truly gone? Legal scholars are now arguing that international biodiversity law must distinguish between ecological extinction and genomic extinction, the irreversible loss of all viable biological information. This distinction carries significant practical consequences for conservation funding and political will. If a species can theoretically be revived, the urgency of preventing its ecological disappearance may be, however subtly, diminished. It is a moral hazard embedded in the vault's very existence, and its custodians are acutely aware of it. The vault currently holds sequences for approximately 4,000 species. Conservative estimates suggest that between 20 and 30% of Earth's remaining species are on trajectories toward ecological extinction within the next 3 decades. Many of them will enter the archive before they leave the living world. The cold storage that awaits them is extraordinary. The science is real, and the possibility of revival is no longer science fiction. But the mountain is not the goal. it is the last resort. The world these species actually inhabited, the living, tangled, irreplaceable web of ecological relationships that no archive can replicate, is still here, still worth protecting, and still within our capacity to defend. Share this story if it moved you. Follow for more investigations at the edge of science and survival, and leave your thoughts below on what we owe the species we have not yet lost.